Much of a pleasure to be here today. You know, the last time I was here, I talked about, this bogus Constitution, the Lecompton Constitution.
Says you, Ling.
These pro-slavery devils gathered in here. You can probably still catch the essence of the sulfur. Led by old Beelzebub himself, John Calhoun.
Here!
Surveyor General of Kansas and Nebraska territories. I let these pro-slavers have it about the pro-slave and Lecompton Constitution. For we all know, and I am proud to say, that I was president of the great, glorious, free state, Topeka Constitution.
Burn it! Burn it! Burn it!
Now we are here today to get a history of Bleeding Kansas. I could probably stand here and tell you all you wanted to know about Bleeding Kansas. But I will defer to this debate today with Mr. Brockett and a Mr. Brown. But before these gentlemen come up on stage here, I would like to have the widow women of Bleeding Kansas please come up and take your seats.
Yankees tugging at our heartstrings.
Well, ain't no wonder you're inviting these women up here. You're nothing but a womanizer, preying on widows.
Sheriff Jones, ladies and gentlemen, about from the South.
Champion Jones!
I'd like to address this issue, ladies, about my reputation out here in Kansas territory. My political enemies, and I will keep this short, my political enemies have always made a sport out of defaming my character. An entertainment for them when they could not otherwise find faults with my proposals and my aspirations. Now the New Englanders, they consider old Jim Lane a crude westerner from the Ohio River, lacking in their culture and sophistication. Borrowing tobacco when I can. There you go, young lady, here's some good tobacco.
Reserve tobacco.
Borrow tobacco when I can. Sometimes divorced, often separated, but never at a loss for feminine intimacy. Slower, totally forgetful in paying my debts, a frequent taker of God's name in vain, deserving the title of political father of political corruption west of the Mississippi, deserving the title of father of political correction to outfox Senator Davy Rice Atchison in Missouri, a mocker of the ministerial profession, a hypnotizer of crowds, and a man ready to promise the moon for political support. Now I ask you, isn't it amazing that one simple, humble man like Jim Lane could accomplish so much? Illuminations, lies, lies, slime by my personal and political enemies out here, spread by jealous and incompetent underachievers. I sometimes ask myself, Jim Lane, what would these folks do if you were happened to die? Well, I'll tell you what, sir.
They clap.
They would be like little piglets. They'd be like little piglets who died, whose mother had died the day before, squealing around. They'd have to hunt up another old Jim Lane just to rally against. But I always tell myself that I never did go into the fruit orchard, that the tree that bore the sweetest apples was the one most clubbed often. Now, if you folks are keen enough of mind to dispel all the negative untruths you sometimes hear about me out here in the territory, search for the truth, and you shall realize that Jim Lane has been the champion of freedom and liberty throughout this great free state of ours. And with that, I shall end by wishing you all happiness and prosperity.
I've heard enough nonsense.
Hoping to meet you again before the next election. I bid each and every one of you farewell, Godspeed, good luck, good day, good free state citizens of Kansas. I am Jim Lane. I have spoken. I thank you. Carpe diem.
Brockett!
Given the opportunity, Jim Lane to puff about his greatness for hours on end. I will have none of that.
Helps make a lot of people Southerners.
Lady. My name is Brockett. Lieutenant W.B. Brockett. And I ride with the best pro-slavery militia this side of the Mississippi.
Here!
Here.
Commanded by Captain Henry Clay Pate.
Hey!
My question today to you fine gentlemen is who here is sound on the goose?
Sound on the goose, Missouri!
Yes.
I'm not sound on the goose. My name is John Brown.
Brown.
And the goose is slavery. Slavery is an abomination. It is the sum of all villainies. How can you own a brother or a sister?
My family has owned slaves for generations, sir. And we live under the belief that if you do not want to own a slave, then do not own a slave. But you daren't have the right to come here and tell us how we are to live our lives. Look at this man standing here, clothing made of cotton. He probably enjoys a fine bowl of tobacco. He lashes his loads on his wagon with hemp rope. All these items produced from slave labor. This man is a hypocrite.
There are many who are hypocrites. I, however, am not. I live my beliefs. I come from a family of abolitionists. I was born into a family of abolitionists, and my father taught me how evil slavery was. When I was 12, I found out, seeing how evil slavery was. I had befriended a young boy, a slave boy my age, and I witnessed him being beaten with a metal coal shovel by his master. That is what slavery is. But we're not here to speak about me. We're here to speak about events here. Those events began in 1854 when Stephen Douglas, senator from Illinois, wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act to open up the territories to settlement. And he knew he needed Southern support. So he wrote into his bill something that was called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that the residents of those territories could vote on whether those territories would come in to the Union as slave or free.
Kansas needs to come into the Union as a slave state.
You're here.
It makes perfect sense. Missouri has been a slave state for years.
Missouri.
Before that, though, before all that happened, abolitionists knew this was coming, and they organized back east. They organized back east and sent men and supplies out here to make Kansas free. At the same time, pro-slavery men came into Kansas, and violence erupted. So much violence, so quickly, that it soon became known as Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas out here. 5 of those Free Staters who came to Kansas were my sons. They came out here just about in time for the first election for the territorial legislature. March 30th, 1855. On that day, thousands of Missourians came across the border into Kansas, went to the polling places, took over those polling places, many times not allowing Free Staters who lived there to vote, but voting themselves.
The governor of the Kansas territories said that in order to vote, all you had to do was strike a claim. They did not say you had to stay on that claim for any length of time. So myself and some good boys from Missouri came over here and we struck our claims.
You're here.
Now I'm going to go vote. And vote I did.
How often did you vote that day?
I voted 3 times that day.
After the ballots were all secured in their ballot boxes, most of those Missourians went back home to Missouri, where they actually lived.
That's a lie.
And then, when the ballots were finally counted, out of the 2,400 legal residents in the territory, there were nearly 6,000 votes cast. Free Staters cried foul, and the government paid lip service for a little while, but eventually said, it's a legal election. Form your legislature. And they formed their legislature, that bogus legislature. That bogus legislature that began enacting laws laws to make Kansas a slave territory and then a slave state. One of those laws said that you could not print in your newspaper anything that said Kansas should not be a slave state.
That was a just law, sir. That protected the slave owner from the bloodthirsty abolitionists.
That's all.
Spreading those lies about good slave-owning men. They would bring violence on us if they did not pass that law. Hear, hear! That was a great law.
55 continued. My sons, they were having trouble out here. They told everybody that would listen that they were abolitionists and that they were the kind of abolitionists like their father that said all men and all women are brothers and sisters, and that when our black brothers and sisters are freed from their bondage, they will become full and equal citizens in our country with full and equal voting rights.
Nonsense.
That was looked upon as nonsense, as insanity. They wrote back to me where I was living back east. They said, "Father, we are under much pressure out here. The crops have failed. We all have the ague. Please come out, and please bring weapons when you come, because the Free Staters came to Kansas expecting open elections, and the pro-slavers came out here armed to the teeth, and we need weapons." So I came to Kansas and I brought weapons. I had not been here long before the town of Lawrence, headquarters of the Free State movement, was under duress. The governor of Kansas had called in a militia, and nearly 2,000 men from Missouri came in, and they were going to attack Lawrence. They intended to sack the town and burn it and drive every Free Stater out.
If there was ever a town that deserved to be burnt to the ground, it's Lawrence, Kansas.
Drive them out.
But the Free Staters got word that they were coming. They built forts, they armed themselves, they even smuggled a cannon into town. So when those pro-slavers advanced on the town, they realized that they might not live to see another day if they actually attacked. So instead of attacking, they surrounded the town and put it under siege. Now that was fine for the men in Lawrence. They had cabins. They could sleep at night in a warm bed next to a warm fire. The pro-slavery men were living out on the prairie, rough, with a blanket, maybe a tent. And this was early December, in one of the coldest, hardest winters anybody could remember. Those pro-slavery men were freezing. So they asked the territorial governor, Shannon, to come in and do something about it. So he did. He came in and brokered a peace treaty. And both sides eventually signed it.
Me and my boys didn't want a peace treaty. Sure, it was cold out there on the prairie, but we knew when we got into Lawrence and we started setting those buildings on fire, it'd warm us right up.
Ran out of whiskey.
That too, sir.
All the Missourians then went home saying, well, there's always next year. So the Wakarusa War, the war I like to call the war without a battle, ended. A war without a battle, but not a war without a death. Thomas Barber. Sorry, man. Thomas Barber.
My poor Thomas.
Riding home with his brother and another man before the peace treaty was signed to chop wood for his families. 2 miles west of town, 2 pro-slavery men rode up to them. One of them was Clark.
G.W. Clark. I worked with G.W. Clark. He's a good man.
He's a murderer.
He's a good man.
They come up to Barber. They say, you come with us. And Barber said, I don't have to come with you. You have no authority over me. And as he began to ride off, the 2 men whipped out their pistols and shot Barber dead off his horse. They then collected his brother and the other man collected his body and brought him back to the Free State Hotel in Lawrence. And I stood in the doorway of the room in the Free State Hotel where I saw his widow grieving, mourning over her husband's bullet-riddled body. ma'am, that I have to bring that up. These folks need to know that. February of '56. A man named Brown, no relation to me, a Free Stater in Leavenworth, was hacked to death with a hatchet by a pro-slaver. And nothing happened to him. Nothing happened to him, just like nothing happened to Clark. Oh, I forgot to mention. Did Clark and the other man deny the fact that they were shot Barbara? Oh no, they actually could be seen in public arguing about who could take credit for it.
GW said he shot him, and he's a man of his word. If he said he shot him, he's the one that shot him.
As the weather warmed up, so did the violence. On May 21st, we were living down where we call Brown Station on the Mosquito Creek, a tributary of the Pottawatomie. We got word that Lawrence was being marched upon again by pro-slavers, so we rode north to try to help them. But we didn't get to Lawrence. We were met by a man riding south. He said, "If you're going to Lawrence, you're a little late. That smoke there on the horizon is from the Free State Hotel." A posse, they call themselves. About 450 men under the command of Sam Jones, the man who built this building here, came
Good man.
and sacked and burned the town, burned the Free State, and destroyed the 2 Free State newspapers and threw their type in the river. Well, we didn't need to see that. So we turned around and rode back south. As strange as it may seem, I was somewhat relieved to have found out that it was Sam Jones leading that party in Lawrence. I was afraid it might have been Jefferson Buford.
Jefferson Buford, a good southern man from Eufaula, Alabama. He sold 40 of his slaves to outfit an army to come to the Kansas territories and fight for the cause. He would pay the way of the men. They would come here. He would deed them land. They would improve that land for a year, and as repayment for Buford's generosity, they would deed half of it back to him. All said and told, Buford brought over 300 men here to fight for the cause.
And I'd heard what Buford was doing. I'd heard there was an army. I had gotten word or rumors about what was happening. So I did a little intelligence work, and I found out what actually they planned. They planned what they were calling to sweep the Pottawatomie clean of Free Staters. And they didn't care how they did it, as long as they got rid of them. I was afraid there was a massacre brewing. The fact that nothing had happened to Barber's murderers and Mr. Brown's murderers showed me that it was open season on Free Staters. The government would do nothing. There was a pro-slavery army marching through the countryside, threatening killing all the Free Staters. What could you do? You had 2 choices. You could leave and let Kansas be slave, or you could stay and fight.
You should leave.
Go on back.
On the night of the 24th and 25th of May, 5 pro-slavery men were pulled out of the beds at night and hacked to death with broadswords in what became known as the Pottawatomie massacre. My name became associated with it. I have never admitted and I have never denied that I was there. But something had to be done to show the pro-slavers they did not own this territory and could not kill Free Staters with impunity. And something was done.
We weren't killing anybody.
Something was done. He may deny being there, but the facts and the witnesses say otherwise. Please forgive me. You may cover your ears if you want to.
No, it needs to be told.
You can't cover the heart.
This is a foot artillery broadsword. This man, on his way to Kansas, stopped in Ohio and picked up a wagon full of these swords to bring to the Kansas territory. Just around midnight on May 24th, Brown and his henchmen knock on the door of the Doyles. When Mr. Doyle goes to the door, the man on the other side says, "I need directions to Alan Wilkinson's cabin."
If only known we wouldn't be giving them.
As Doyle opens the door, Brown and his henchmen charge in. They demand that Doyle and the sons come with them. Mahala begged for the life of her 14-year-old son to be spared. And by the grace of God, this devil spared his life. Brown and his men took old man Doyle and his sons a few hundred yards down the lane. They stop. Brown draws his revolver and shoots old man Doyle in the head, killing him. As the boys see this, they try to run. They fall upon William right away, and they hack him to death with these swords. Drury made it a little farther. He got into the brush, but they soon fell upon him, and he met the same fate. With their job done here, they move on to Alan Wilkinson's cabin. Again, Brown knocks on the door. Wilkinson does not want to let him in.
No, he didn't.
But Brown said they'll break the door down. So Wilkinson went ahead and opened it. They charged in. They found Wilkinson nursing his sick wife in bed with a fever. They told Wilkinson, "You're coming with us." He said, "Let me be. Let me stay here at night with my wife. In the morning, I will go get the neighbor to come here and look over her, and I will freely go with you." But Brown would have nothing to do with that. They pulled him out of the cabin. And he meets the same fate as the Doyle boys.
My husband was a good man, did not deserve to die that way.
No, he didn't, man.
And none of us had slaves.
Did
They moved from there looking for Dutch Henry down on the Pottawatomie. Dutch Henry Sherman. Luckiest man alive that night. He was out on the prairie looking for lost cattle, and he was not in his cabin. But his brother, William, was, and he'd do just fine. They pulled him from the cabin, took him down to the shores of the Pottawatomie, ran him through with a sword, and let his body fall into the creek.
That's Kansas territory.
5 men killed, and their only crime was owning slaves.
No, we didn't know slaves.
But they didn't own slaves. None of these men have ever owned a slave. Ever. They were killed for their political leanings, for words they had spoken, but not for owning slaves.
Slavery is a war waged by the slave owner against the slave. Anyone who assists that war, whether or not they actually own slaves, is a soldier in that war and should expect the lot of a soldier. And much is made about the youth of some of the men that were killed that night. 15, 16, 17. But remember, a black boy who had been enslaved had been a slave by the time he was 15 for 10 years and could expect to be a slave the rest of his life. One of the results of the Pottawatomie massacre was that Buford's army disbanded and did not sweep the Pottawatomie clean of Free Staters. Instead, his men scattered and joined other pro-slavery militias around the territory. One of them was to Henry Clay Pate's militia.
Captain Henry Clay Pate. Captain Pate hailed from Virginia, but had moved to Westport, Missouri, where he started a successful business of running a newspaper and as an attorney. He had formed a militia called the Westport Rifles, of which I'm a lieutenant in that militia. T.W. Hayes, the U.S. Marshal for the Southern District of Kansas, deputized Captain Pate and gave him a warrant for the arrest of John Brown and the other murderers on the Pottawatomie. We were ordered by T.W. Hayes to proceed to the area around Pottawatomie to hunt for Brown. But before we left Westport, Governor Shannon, the governor of the Kansas Territories, opened up the federal arsenal in Liberty, Missouri, and provided us with federal firearms out of that arsenal. As a sign of our gratitude for Shannon opening up that arsenal, we changed our name from the Westport Rifles to Shannon Sharpshooters. And we headed towards Pottawatomie. When we arrived, we found two of Brown's sons right outside of Osawatomie. We arrested them. Of course, they denied any doings with the Pottawatomie massacre, but they're Browns, so we knew they were lying. We turned them over to the federal officials, the military, who brought them up to Camp Sackett, just south of here. After we'd turned them over, we were again ordered to scout the area around Palmyra and Prairie City, Kansas. So we proceeded to a place called Blackjack Springs Campground. Been a campground on the Santa Fe Trail since the 1820s. It was a good campground. Always had water. You see, Captain's Creek flowed through that land. It had two arms, one to the west, one to the east. They met in the middle, formed a capital Y. We camped there knowing that it would be a good central location to scout the rest of the area. This was June 1st, 1856, early in the morning. Captain Pate ordered 5 of our men to ride into Palmyra and Prairie City, scout out, see if they could find out any information on John Brown. So those boys took off, and we waited for their return.
I had heard that they were marauding around the territory. I had heard that they'd captured my sons, but I had not heard that they had turned them over. Those 5 boys came into Prairie City that Sunday morning, June 1st. They expected to have no trouble at all. Sleepy little town on the Santa Fe Trail, Sunday morning, no problem. Except they didn't realize that one of the 2 churches in town was having a revival meeting that morning, and the town was full of people. And many of those people were men, and many of those men were armed. And all those armed men were obviously free staters. And that those 5 boys realized they were in trouble and they'd better get out of there as fast as they could. So they turned and they ran, and 2 of them made it, and 3 of them did not.
Hear, hear.
Those armed free staters numbered about 25, comprising 2 militias, one led by Sam Shore, the other led by me. Sam and I set those 3 boys down and we questioned them. We said, "Who are you? Who are you with, and where are you at?" One of them said, "We're with Captain Henry Clay Payton and the Shannon sharpshooters, and we got a fortified position over at Blackjack, so you better not go over there or you'll be in trouble." Well, in spite of that, some of the young men in our militia, they wanted to go right then and try to catch up to the 2 that escaped and then go right on and attack Pate's camp. And I said, "No, it is broad daylight. And they outnumber us. Military doctrine says you don't attack a fortified position unless you have at least 2-to-1 superiority. If we go over there now, we'll be massacred. No, we'll wait until they're not expecting us." So Sam and I sat down and we planned the rest of that day about what we would do. And when it got dark, we started moving the 3 miles between Prairie City and Blackjack Springs. I wanted to get to Pate's camp before any light, surround them, and as soon as you could see, strike and take them. But it didn't quite work out that way. We did not go on the Santa Fe Road. Even though it was somewhat improved and would have been an easier trek, we figured it would be watched, so we went cross-country. And we went cross-country. You have to be careful out on the prairie. If you carry a light at night, you can be seen for miles, especially when it's a dark night. And that was a dark night because it was the night of the new moon. The new moon rises at dawn and casts no light. So unfortunately, it took us much longer than I had intended. As a matter of fact, when we were approaching from the west, it had already gotten very light, much too light.
Those 2 riders that rode from Prairie City rode into camp, warning Captain Payton and myself that Prairie City was full of armed assassins. So Captain Payton gave the order to line the wagons up, facing to the west, to form a breastworks to fight behind. He then ordered that several of the men be stationed on the hillsides around Blackjack Springs. They were to warn if they saw any men coming across the prairie and then skedaddle back into camp. The rest of the men set the tents up behind the wagons and got ready to bed down for the night. But just then, some riders came into our camp. John D. Pennybacker brought 10 men in and some prisoners that they had rounded up while they were out looking for Brown. That brought the total number of men we had in camp to right at 35. Pennybacker and his men had been a part of Buford's army that had recently disbanded. We were welcome to have the additional guns in camp. Early the next morning, June 2nd, 1856, just before sunrise, the sentry to the northwest spots men moving across the prairie. He fires off a shot and rides back into camp. Everyone that had been bedded down was awoken by the shot. We lined ourselves behind the wagons. It didn't take long before we saw men moving over the top of the hill. It was still dark, but you could make out their shapes plainly. Captain Pate told us to hold our fire. He let the men get about halfway down that hill, and we opened up on them. So much fire poured into them that they turned around and ran right back up that hill that they came down. But one thing we didn't know, while our attention was focused to the northwest on those boys, another group had moved into the southwest of us. And they opened up from the far creek bank into our ranks behind the wagons. Within the first few minutes, we'd taken several casualties. R.A. Wood shot through the neck, through both lungs, and passed out through his shoulder blade. We feared he was mortally wounded. McGoldrich shot through the cheek, carried his tongue and teeth away. We did not think he would live either. Several boys were wounded in the arms, legs, hands. Captain Pate, knowing that if we stayed in this position we'd be cut to pieces, ordered the men down into the creek bank directly to the front of us, where the bank would at least afford some protection.
My men were approaching from the southwest. Shore's men were on the northwest. We saw him being taken under fire. And while Pate and his men were busy with Shore's men, we moved down into the creek and went along the creek. And as soon as we could, we took his wagons under fire. Apparently he didn't realize that musket balls and mini balls would go through wooden wagons, but he quickly found out that they do. He came down into the creek, right opposite us, very close, in some places less than 50 yards. And we did not massacre each other because of the way the creeks are arranged there. There are high banks on both sides, so that the only time you have to expose yourself to enemy fire is when you're firing yourself. You can duck down after you fire, behind the creek, behind the bank, out of sight of the enemy to reload. And that's what Pate and his men did. They fired, they ducked down, they reloaded and came right back up. I told my men, once you fire and duck down and reload, don't you come back up in the same place. Before you come back up, move. If you do that, he will never get a count on us. And he never did.
We never did. We thought we were up against a force of at least 100 Free Staters.
When there were only 25 of us.
But this grand commander here that has ordered his men to use these tactics of ducking down and moving, well, not all of his boys listened to him. One of the men on my side, young Henry James from Franklin County, 19-year-old man, noticed one of the Free Staters would shoot. And after he'd shoot, he'd crow like a crow. Drop right down where he was, come right back up in the same spot. So young Henry James crawled through the tall grass between the creek and the wagons. He crawled underneath the flap of a tent, and on the back side of that tent, he took his knife out and cut a slit in it. Stuck the muzzle of his rifle through, and the next time that young Free State boy jumped up and crowed, young Henry James shot him down. So not all of Brown's men listened to him.
Any of you with experience dealing with teenage men will understand that they may not always listen to you the first time. But I guarantee you, he always listened to me after that. It was an intense battle, and it progressed for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. Men were being wounded, and quite a few were deciding it was time to leave. Sam Shore himself went off probably for breakfast somewhere, and I never saw him again after that. You have to understand that these were young men, never had been in the military, never had been fired at. They were used to weapons all right, they were used to hunting. They were going after deer and bear and rabbits. Interesting thing about deer and bear and rabbits, they don't shoot back. And the men at Blackjack were shooting back. So quite a few of them decided it was time to go. So by about 3 hours into the battle, I was down to 8 or 9 men. You still had how many?
We still had about 20 men left in our camp.
20 men.
We'd sent one of them back early in the battle. One of the men that was slightly wounded. Captain Pate put him on a horse and sent him back to Johnson County. Try to round up some good pro-slavery boys to come in and help with the fight. But we'd seen hide nor hair of him since we put him on that horse. What we did see was a dust cloud rising from the prairie in the direction of Lawrence. And we were mighty afraid that reinforcements might be headed to help the Free Staters in this fight.
I knew that I could not fool Pate very long with 8 or 9 men, and that once he realized he outnumbered us, he'd rush us, and that would end the battle. So I did something that I hated to do, something rather desperate. I told 2 of my men who had the best weapons to go up on the high ground, take aim at where Pate's horses and mules were standing, and begin shooting them. Now, why would I do that?
Because you're a madman.
I knew that Pate would realize that once his horses and mules started dying, that if they all died, he would be stranded in enemy territory, territory he had been marauding through without any means to get back to Missouri except walking, and that if he had to walk, well, he might not get back there in one piece.
Now, we weren't marauding through that territory. As we rode through the territory, we were warning all the Free State people along the way that there was a murderer loose in the territories. And it might be best for them to relocate out of the area. By us taking some of their possessions away, it just made that move easier for them. One thing that we were afraid of when the horses and mules started getting gunned down was that we would be trapped on foot on open prairie, being pursued by armed horsemen. That is not a situation you want to be in. You can't outrun a horse. So our fear was getting trapped on the prairie. Not that we'd be in enemy territory. There were plenty of good pro-slavery men between us and Missouri that would help us out.
One of my sons in Kansas was Frederick. He was in his early 20s, very strong physically, but he had seizures. He had debilitating headaches. And I was concerned that if he was on the front lines at Blackjack and he had a seizure, that I would have to deal with my son's seizure at the same time I was trying to run a battle. And I had enough to worry about. So I had him stationed behind us over the crest of the hill, taking care of our horses and mules. And then, not too long after Pate's horses and mules began being shot, I heard a commotion and I looked up the creek, not far from me. Frederick, on one of his brother's horses, rode over the crest of the hill, down into the creek, back up into the grass area, turned and rode right down between the 2 lines of men that had just been firing at each other, waving his saber over his head, shouting, "Father, we have them surrounded and have cut off their lines of communication," and rode off. I believe that Pate thought Frederick was the vanguard of those reinforcements coming from Lawrence, and that he better do something quick, so a white flag went up.
Pate had asked for volunteers. Someone to carry a flag of truce over to the enemy lines. Young Henry James gladly volunteered. And as a show of good faith, one of the prisoners that we had, Graham, pacing along. They walked over to the enemy lines and met this man.
They come up to me, I assume because I was the oldest one there. I say, are either one of you the captain of this militia? They say, no. I say, well, I'm not talking to anybody but him. Go get him. So the Free State man turns and he walks back towards Pate's line. And young James, Henry James, is that
Henry
your-
James.
He stood there trying to stare me down. He was the bravest young man I've ever seen. We could have used a dozen more like him there at Blackjack if only he'd been on the right side.
He was on the right side.
So, Pate comes over. Deputy U.S. Marshal, attorney, publisher, poet, Virginian,
Successful businessman. Something
aristocrat,
you're not, Brown.
aristocrat. Comes up and waves his finger at me. I was afraid he might stick it up my nose. He said, I am a deputy U.S. Marshal, and you are in violation of my authority. I have the warrant here for the arrest of certain persons, meaning John Brown, the man who was standing in front of him. And if you don't do this, and if you don't do that, dictating, probably the way Napoleon sounded when he dictated peace terms to a vanquished enemy instead of the young man, because ladies present, I'll say young man, who put up the white flag to talk. He didn't seem like he was talking. I was wondering if he was stalling for time. So, I got fed up with him very quickly. I pulled out my pistol, cocked it, pointed it at his chest, and said, you are my prisoner. And he said, no, I'm not your prisoner. You're violating the rules of war. I'm under a white flag. You're no gentleman. And began arguing and continued to argue like that. And I tried to convince him that he was my prisoner. And he said, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And while he was doing that, several of my men were able to reposition themselves so that when Pate finally did turn around to look back at his lines, he realized he could not get back there safely, and that he indeed was my prisoner. He said that he didn't know he was up against John Brown. He said if I'd have known I was up against him, I never would have tried to talk. And he later said, I never surrendered that man.
He did it.
That man tricked me.
And he did trick him. For centuries, a white flag flown on a field of battle means the fighting stops and the talking starts. All hostilities cease. You talk to your enemy. You may not agree with what is being said. And as Brown said, you might think they're actually stalling for time. But it does not matter. That is still a white flag, a truce. And it is to be obeyed. If you do not believe what is being said, you release that person to go back to their lines. And you return to the fight. But to take someone prisoner under a white flag of truce is against the rules of warfare. But then again, we know the type of person that we're dealing with in John Brown.
Pate forgot one of the rules of life. All is fair in love and war. After Pate capitulated, I'll give him that, he told the rest of his men, he signaled them to put down their arms, and they did. So we went over, took them all prisoner, collected their weapons, and we went back to Prairie City that very day. We sat down and we negotiated surrender terms, and we signed documents, and then we negotiated a prisoner exchange. Pate said he could get my 2 sons back from the military in exchange for him and Brockett here. And I wanted my sons back, so I said, yes, we will do that. But we didn't stay in Prairie City. It was way too exposed. So we left and went about 8.5 miles south and west to camp on land owned by a very good friend of mine, Toy Jones. We were down there camped, waiting for the prisoner exchange, which was promised. Battle of Blackjack was June 2nd. On June 5th, a troop of dragoons arrives, coming down from Fort Leavenworth under the command of Colonel Edwin Sumner. The territorial governor had ordered him to come down and force us to release Pate and his men. I didn't want to release them. I argued with Sumner. I said, we have documents here. He said, those are all void. You have no right to negotiate. Disband your militias and release your prisoners. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. Oh, by the way, Sumner was assisted by a young lieutenant who was out in Kansas on his first assignment after having graduated West Point. His name was Jeb Stewart. Jeb Stewart and I met on Torrey Jones' land. So, even though I didn't want to, I released Pate and his men to go do deviltry other places. And of course, that's not the end of the story of the aftermath of Blackjack, but it's all we will speak of here today. I myself, I'm going back east, and I'm taking with me Henry Clay Pate's Bowie knife that I took from him at Blackjack. And we shall see what happens in the future.
This is not the ending. This is only the beginning.
Brockett and Brown have left the house.
Fantastic job.
Thank you all very much.
My name is Kerry Altenbernd. This is Jeff Quigley. We're with the Blackjack Battlefield Trust. I'm the president and he's site manager. He keeps that place, if you've been out to Blackjack, he keeps it looking the way it does. If you've been out there, let's give him a round of applause. So, we're opening it up to questions now. Does anybody have any questions?
So what was the casualty figures from both sides of Blackjack?
Well, there were no fatalities, at least that we know of.
That we know of.
Now, Missourians may have, that have been wounded there may have gone back to Missouri and died later of their wounds, but there are no official deaths from Blackjack. Several recent books that have mentioned Blackjack, which actually we're happy that they mentioned Blackjack, and the old ones didn't used to do that, say that up to 4 Missourians died there, but no one died at the battle, and there were some severe wounds. You talked about, what was his name that got shot through the lungs?
R.A. Wood.
Yeah.
In a later writing, it said that at the time of the battle they thought they were mortally wounded, but they did survive.
Yes,
So Pate had, that we can find documented, 5 men that were wounded.
and A.O. Carpenter, who was the son of Corinna Nichols, was wounded in the armpit. He had his arm up like that, and the bullet went in, and actually they took the bullet and the cloth from his shirt. And now that should have been a mortal wound, but he survived. And his mother, who was an abolitionist, took those back east and showed them, said, these came out of my son. This is what the war in Kansas is like.
Describe to us the archaeological excavations and the interesting story about that effort.
We had 2 actually.
Yeah, we had 2 in 2006? Yeah, 2006, Doug Scott, who was a battlefield archaeologist, used to work for the National Park Service, came out and did the majority of the battlefield and determined that property was pretty much picked over in the past. But then 2 years ago, the show Diggers, the National Geographic show, they came out and were there for an afternoon, and they actually found some bullets.
They were there for about 12 hours.
Yeah, in an area that Doug Scott couldn't get to because it was too overgrown at the time he was there. It was pretty overgrown.
We found 36 caliber balls from Navy revolvers, mini balls from 69 caliber smooth ball muskets, mini balls from
and this
41 muskets,
smeared piece of
and
lead, which must probably hit
flattened
something
lead
flat.
that had struck the
Couldn't
ground.
tell what it was, but it was obviously fired.
The trust did not have in their possession any artifacts from the battle.
Before that.
before that.
Now we do.
So now we do,
Just
so.
bear in mind that it's important from this story that when you find an artifact, take note of it and don't just pick it up
Pick
off
it
the
up.
ground.
And absolutely, this show Diggers, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but to watch it on TV, it could give you the illusion of being quite haphazard. But they have archaeologists with them. They will spot, or through metal detecting, they'll find an artifact. They'll get GPS coordinates. The archaeologist will actually come over, and they will then remove the product from the ground, determine if it's of value. If it is, of course, they film. Yes.
John Brown, you alluded to the Bowie knife, and
Yes.
what's the significance of that knife?
Well, the Bowie knife, he took to a blacksmith in Connecticut, and he had him make 1,000 copies of it and put them on the end of 6-foot poles. And those are John Brown's pikes that he took to Harper's Ferry. There are a lot of connections with Harper's Ferry to blackjack. As a matter of fact, Carl Gridley, who's a local historian, said that the Battle of Blackjack and the raid on Harper's Ferry are the bookends of John Brown's war on slavery. John Brown began his actual physical war on slavery at Blackjack, and he ended it at Harper's Ferry. He didn't intend to end it at Harper's Ferry, but that's what happened. Of course, Jeb Stewart, who met John Brown in the aftermath of Blackjack, was Lee's lieutenant at Harper's Ferry and was the one who identified John Brown, so the world knew that John Brown was the one leading the raid at Harper's Ferry. And that's just two of the connections. So that's why we think we're justified in saying that it wasn't a major battle, as battles go. A lot of men weren't involved, but it was an extremely important battle, and we like to think it was really the first battle in what was the Civil War. Early on, sort of like Lexington and Concord, small battle early on, but the ramifications were significant. If John Brown hadn't fought the Battle of Blackjack, I don't know if he'd have gone to Harper's Ferry. Maybe not. That's revisionist history, but Kansas was important. Let's just say that much.
How were your respective characters able to support their families while you were
Good
on
question.
these campaigns?
I don't know.
My character, W.B. Brockett, actually was single at the time, so he just was concerned with himself. He actually was a government surveyor that he and G.W. Clark actually worked here in Lecompton
Worked out of this.
for a short time. Once Brockett actually stabbed a Free State man, George Bailey, in '57 here, and I believe at that time he relocated to Fort Scott,
Where he was known as.
where he was known as Fort Scott Brockett, and was also involved in the Meridocene massacre there. So
And even the pro-slavery man, he was.
he was thought of as even rough
Yeah.
to pro-slavery.
He was run out of Fort Scott by the pro-slavery men. But he ended up in Louisiana.
He ended up in Louisiana. He was a state auditor for the state of Louisiana. So he did.
He was successful, yeah.
Did find a different kind of work.
As far as John Brown, of course, his wife and the young children and several of the sons were living in, well, they were all living in North Elba, New York. And then when John Brown came out to Kansas, and of course the Secret Six and other lesser known, probably not known at all, anonymous people supplied money and assistance to the family so that he could do that. Now, not a lot. They were pretty poor. Most of the money that John Brown got went into the cause.
Prairie City and Palmyra, where are they? Is either one of them the present day Baldwin City?
Palmyra's on the north side of Baldwin City.
It's on the
Prairie
map
City's on
right
the
up
south
there.
side. They no longer exist per se, but that's where they were
Yeah,
before Baldwin
Palmyra and
City.
Prairie City, they're close to each other. Do you know Baldwin? Okay, the stoplight, you go north from the stoplight, that's Palmyra. Prairie City is pretty much the southern suburbs. There's not really anything there now except the cemetery.
Cemetery.
I think 3 little towns combined to be Baldwin City.
We have a young man in the back.
How many of John Brown's sons survived Bleeding Kansas?
Well, only one died in Bleeding, Kansas, Frederick. He was killed in the battle. He was, well, actually not during the battle. He was killed just hours prior to the Battle of Pottawatomie. He was gunned down. So the rest of the sons survived. Of course, 2 of them Oliver and Watson were killed at Harper's Ferry. So John Brown lost 3 sons to the cause, and of course himself too. But he didn't mind that. He decided by that time that the Lord had intended him to die to fight slavery, not to live to fight slavery. So he actually welcomed in his death and said, please don't make me wait unnecessarily. Yes.
They were killed or hung at Harper's Ferry?
They were all hanged.
All 3?
Oh no, the sons were shot. Frederick died in Kansas, and actually he's buried in Pottawatomie under that obelisk down there, about a block from the park. And his other 2 sons are buried with him up in North Elbow, New York. But John Brown was hanged. All of the men that were hanged, all the men were executed because of Harper's Ferry were hanged.
How far is Blue Jack from Fort Scott?
You mean Blackjack?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's about 90 miles.
about 90 miles, okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Fort Scott's, where is Fort Scott?
It's not.
Fort Scott's here, and Blackjack is right there, so it's that distance right there.
She knows a phone.
Mention that, tell the story of the letter from Mahala.
You tell the story.
Well, you tell the story, Mahala.
Mahala did get back to her family in Tennessee, and she wrote a letter to John Brown while he was incarcerated at Harper's Ferry. And one of the jailers salvaged it, and we do have a print of it.
Question in the back?
When did historians and the local community become aware of the Battle of Blackjack? Because many of us grew up not knowing about
Well,
it. until
it's
recently.
always been known about, but it just was I think the attitude that used to have for Blackjack is expressed on the sign at in Blackjack Park, which is the 2-acre park along the 56 highway. It talks about it and says the battle, and battle is in quotes. It's like, it's not, how can it be important? There were only 75 men there. Nobody died, it happened in Kansas, how could it be important? That's obviously changing. It gone from, ignored, like you said, never heard about it. I didn't hear about the Battle of Blackjack until I was grown.
At the time it happened, it was in all the papers
Oh, yeah.
back east. It was huge.
People called it
when
Civil
happened.
War. People called it Civil, yeah.
But really, I don't think it's really gained the notoriety that it's starting to now, except for the last 10 years, since the trust actually became involved.
It was the first, well, not counting the Saturday
Make people
Lawrence.
aware of it.
It was the first big action in the summer of '56, and it wasn't the last one. And so there were so many others, it was like, oh, and then, oh, and by, you kind of forget the first by the time you're last. And then you go into Civil War when you have hundreds of thousands of men shooting at each other, and it kind of dwindled away. Plus, after the war, Kansans wanted to forget their past, because they wanted to make money and have a good life, and that was an embarrassment. And it's not to us, and but it was to them apparently.
It's 7 years between Blackjack and Lawrence
Yeah,
Quantrill. That's 7
Quantrill.
years of fighting there. Have either one of you heard of the Battle of Morristown? Just by Freeman, Missouri.
I haven't.
just-
But there was stuff
There
on
were
both
so
sides.
many, so many
So
small
much.
battles that.
Battles all over the place, and well, this area was just
Sounds like
not a
good
nice
job for
place.
you.
It was an interesting place to live, let's just say that.
Yes, back in the back.
Does your trust group have a lot of the land that was actually the battle site, or is the lot still on private property?
Yes and no. We own the core of the battlefield where the 2 creeks come together. We own both of the small creeks, which was the center of the end of the battlefield. We do not own really much of the tail, and the hill that Shore came over is in private hands. But of course, the battle ranged back and forth. Not everybody stayed in one place. So we don't know exactly the extent, because there was nobody sitting there recording where everybody went. And unlike the Civil War battles, there was no topographical engineer along to sit down and draw out the maps of where everybody was. And everybody left that same day and didn't come back. So knowing exactly the extent is why you need archaeology. Unfortunately, There's been a lot of picking over, but we haven't done any archaeology on
But
private land.
as far as the core battlefield,
We own
do
that.
own all that.
Yeah, 40 acres. The Blackjack Battlefield and Nature Park includes the core of that. And also the Robert Hall Pearson farmhouse, which was built in 1890 by a participant in the battle who actually bought the land that included the battle after the battle and lived the rest of his life on that land.
Which side was he on?
Oh, he was with John Brown. He was in the Coal Creek Boys. They came in as reinforcements for Brown during the battle.
Are those,
Next.
are those
Yeah.
authentic or replica weapons that you were actually carrying, or? I noticed one of them here had a substantial bore.
Well,
Mine is a replica. It's a replica of a 1841 Mississippi rifle, which was used in the battle, but it's a replica. His has a little bit different.
yeah, this has a
story.
different story. This is a period copy of a 1853 Sharp slant breech, the so-called Beecher's Bibles, okay? When I say period copy, this was made at the time, and we're not exactly sure of the entire history. This came from Nepal. About 15 years ago, some Americans found that there were about 30,000 weapons, old weapons, 18th, 19th century weapons in the Royal Armory in Kathmandu, Nepal. Went over and bought them all and brought them back to the country. Most of them were British. British Brown Bessons, Enfields, Martini Rosses. There was a 16th century cannon. There were all kinds of things in there. And there was a supply of these. The story is, or the theory is that an actual original got to Nepal. They reverse engineered it and made these copies, but it was for arming the army of the king of Nepal. However, lately there's been some discussion about exactly what the origins of these are, is because they've been tests done and they think the stocks are South American hardwood. And it's how would that happen? Well, there's some speculation that these actually may have been started off as Confederate weapons that may or may not have been finished and found their way to Nepal on the international market trade, and that were maybe finished in Nepal. And so the history is pretty obscure, let's say that much. But this one had at least part of its life sitting in the Royal Armory in Nepal.
Did you have a question, sir, Beck?
Yeah,
54.
I always considered the Battle of Blackjack as the first battle of the Civil War.
Pardon me?
I looked at the Battle of Blackjack as the first battle of the Civil War.
We consider it that. We do get some argument, especially with some folks in the room here, that might think that the battle for Titus, at least that's the first fatality there.
Yeah,
But,
you guys are the first battle.
but
We're
our
the first
our ground was the first ground that was fought over by two groups of men, both professing different political views
Over slavery.
over slavery, organized as military units. As I said, I was Lieutenant Brockett. I was actually a lieutenant, or my character actually was a lieutenant. Just like on Brown's militia, they had officers and such also, and they tried to use as many military tactics as they could. So,
And Brown had studied
And
military.
at Harper's Ferry, they had General Lee and Jeff Stewart both, right?
correct?
Actually, it was Colonel Lee.
Colonel Lee.
Yeah.
Of the U.S. Army.
Union
yes.
Army.
Of the U.S. Army.
Right. Yeah, that was before Jeff Stewart got cranky, I guess. Yes.
It seems like, from what you said, Frederick Brown
Yeah,
kind
Frederick.
of saved the day. I mean, was the one who really turned the tide coming down, saying, "Oh, we're surrounded." We're
Yeah.
surrounded. Do you know? Have they discussed that?
That is an open
Did you
question
just
that we
say
will
that?
never know the answer. She said it was a plan for Frederick to do that. I don't know. Whether he did that spontaneously, or whether they had plans and say, if you need to do this. It would be kind of hard to plan. I mean, if you think about it, say, okay, when the battle's going against us, jump over the hill and ride down between the two lines and expect that you won't be shot by somebody and ride off. So my guess is that he just got the right idea, or he might have, had a seizure and just, who knows, maybe he had a hallucination. I don't know.
Very clever.
Yeah, but it did cause it pushed it to what it was, to the ending. I don't know what John Brown would have done without that, because there really weren't reinforcements coming from Lawrence. That was just dust on the horizon. Yes.
I just recently read an autobiography of a preacher that told instance about how John Brown was a visitor in his parents' home many, many times when he was growing up, and they called him Uncle Brown, very beloved in the home. And then he talked about the day that John Brown was executed. The church steeples in all around where they lived rang for the hour prior to John Brown's execution, and tears freely shed all around the table as they all just sat around the table weeping at the thought of this beloved man dying.
Yeah, the church, that reminded me, church, but not only in that area, but church bells across New England rang out when John Brown died. That was the only way the abolitionists could comment on it. Yes, sir, in the back.
The artifacts that they found at the Battle of Blackjack, where's that located at now?
We have them.
Display somewhere?
No, we don't have any place to display them. Eventually we hope to. Someday we'll probably build a visitor center out at Blackjack that will include a small museum, but right now we don't really have any means to do it and keep them secure.
Want to get one more question?
One more question? No more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jim Lane needs to comment about this scurrilous womanizing situation out here. I will admit that I do like the ladies. I love the ladies. I love my dearly departed grandmother. I love my dearly departed mother. I love my wife so much that I married her twice. And Jim Lane, like these Free State ladies here, Jim Lane loves all the good-hearted, loyal Free State women of Kansas. Oh, Jeff Quigley, thank you very much. Excellent program, Mr. Brockett. Kerry Altenbernd, thank you very much, sir. John Brown, excellent. And I'd like to introduce the widows today on the south side of Overtly. Charlene Winter, from Lecompton as Mahala Doyle. Charlene Winter. Next to Charlene is Deb Powell, from Lecompton with the Lecompton Historical Society as Louisa Jane Wilkinson. On the right side, the north side, this is Jan Elder from Baldwin, Kansas as Matilda Barber. Ladies, by the way, are with the Lecompton reenactors. Also, I wanted to mention
Tim, I think we should recognize Jen Biles. She is a reporter from the Topeka Capitol, and she is doing a series of stories on Freedom's Frontier, and this is something that's going to be very valuable to the people of Kansas.
Jen, would you like to stand, please? Thank you very much. And next week, we're going to be hearing about a pretty famous Jayhawker out here in Kansas Territory, James Montgomery. Max Nervous is coming up from Quebec County to talk about his thesis that he did on Montgomery. And in person, we're going to have James Montgomery here, ladies and gentlemen. That gentleman right there, please stand. That's Rich Ankerholtz from Oskaloosa, Kansas. You'll be portraying James Montgomery.
You may not be worth it.
Yes, go ahead.
If you haven't been out to the Blackjack Battlefield, you should come and walk it. The Blackjack Battlefield and Nature Park, which includes, as we said, the main part of the battlefield, is open year-round, dawn to dusk, for self-guided tours. We have walking tour brochures down on the table next to the door. So if you haven't already, then stop there and look at the information on that table. But please come out. BlackjackBattlefield.org is our website. We're on Facebook. And we do a lot of different activities out there during the year. So we actually do, that's where we learned to do this. This is the first time we've actually done this indoors with no clues in the landscape that we can use. So this has been interesting.
Very good. And Rich is also a member of the Compton Reenactors, and we have Alan Sherrill from Tecumseh, Kansas here today, also a member of the Compton Reenactors. And with that, I want to thank you all for coming out today. Hope you come next week. Thank you for patronizing this program series. Thank you for your financial help with this series too, so we can keep it going on. Next year will be the 20th annual Beating Kansas Lecture Series. It will be the 160th anniversary of this building. You're sitting in a 159-year-old building. Thank you for your great support of Constitution Hall.